There are two big trends happening right now. The main one is that we are facing a different landscape, and that includes not only demographic changes affecting our families and the students we serve. There is also more competition. We are also facing some challenges in terms of affordability, and also technology is affecting really the way we are going to be teaching and the way our students need to be learning. So that is sort of like, essentially we are facing this new landscape for education, K-12 education. The other trend that we're seeing is that, during the years of the recession, 2007, 2009, many of heads who were approaching retiring age, they decided to stay put longer. But now it seems like they are ready to leave. So finally, right, especially our baby boomers. So we are seeing new transitions in headship, but one of the very interesting trends that we're seeing in that aspect is that a third of the new heads are replacing heads who stay only for 3 years or less in headship. So this is what we're calling unexpected turnovers or sudden turnovers. And we don't know yet what that is happening, but essentially the message for you today is we really need to make sure that boards and heads are working together in partnership. And right now I'm just going to share with you a couple of data that we have for both the national trends and for SAIS schools in particular. And the way I have structured these slides are around board structure, the board work and leadership dynamics, and the last piece is on board roles and responsibilities. So starting with board structure, let's talk about board composition. In the survey that we conducted, we found that the average board size at SAIS schools was around 19, which, as you can see on the table on the left, is very similar to the number for boards at the national level, NAIS schools. And on the right-hand side, what you see is what is the percentage of each of these groups representing the board. In the case of SAIS schools, the majority are current parents, and these are the bars in fuchsia. Is slightly higher. It's actually much higher than current parents in independent schools in general, the national level. And in terms of board size, the board size research shows that it can impact the innovation and how innovative the board and how effective the board can be. Actually, there is a recent research done by JMI ranking, and this was done on corporate boards. But what they discovered is that smaller boards tend to be better at producing better returns to shareholders in a period of 3 years. And the reasoning behind that is that smaller boards tend to have deeper discussions and also are more agile when decision-making happens. To give you also another benchmark number, the board source, which is the authority in governance for all nonprofits, in the research that they have done, they find that the average nonprofit has a size of 15 members. So we're still above the number for all nonprofits. In terms of board diversity, why is board diversity important? Because two things. One, also, the board composition can impact its performance, but also it talks about the values that the board shares, and also it affects the way the board leads. So in the survey, we ask heads and board chairs, what are the different items that you take into account when recruiting new members? And what we have here is that the light green represents the answers given by heads, and all of this is SAIS schools. And the dark green represents the answers by board chairs. And I know it's difficult to read, but the two main areas where both groups agree on were the number one item in consideration was passion for the school's mission, and the second one was desired skills. There were other areas there related to demographics like socioeconomic status, gender, alumni status, geography, etc. But the two main were, again, passion for the school's mission and also desired skills. What we also noticed in the data was some disconnects, and one of them is around race and ethnicity, where 6 out of 10 heads said that that was important when recruiting board members, and that number was much lower for board chairs. And another area was also around community connections. We also asked them how satisfied were they with all these different dimensions when recruiting members. And both groups also said that there were areas for improvement, in particular around race and ethnicity, LGTB, but in the areas of age and gender, they seem to be more satisfied. And these are represented by the two first group of columns. Again, the dark green represents the answers by heads, and the yellow is the answers by board chairs. What you're noticing also in this slide is that heads had a higher level of satisfaction than the heads. Board chairs, had a higher level of satisfaction than the heads when it comes to the current composition of their boards. In terms of gender, I was also checking out the numbers for SAIS schools, and indeed, yes, there are 43% of board members who are women. In terms of age group, also it seems to be more spread than what we're seeing for the national numbers, so that is good news. But when it comes to satisfaction with diversity, one of the things that is recommended by research is that you might need to look again at your recruiting practices, because moving away probably from your usual connections might help you in bringing on the type of talent and leadership skills that you want to have. Another conversation that is important for boards to have is, what is the ideal look of the board in terms of diversity, perspective, networks, and have that discussion as a group. I also mentioned that why it's important to pay attention to the board composition because of two things. One is the composition of your board impacts the way you lead, and also the composition of your board is a reflection of your own values. When we talk about how you lead, a board that is too homogeneous in any area might have some blind spots. And when you have blind spots, it's difficult for you to work on strategies and plans that might be helpful for your school. In this case, I wanted to share with you, as we saw before, right? There is some disconnects in terms of race and ethnicity, and heads and boards also express dissatisfaction with the way the current composition in terms of race and ethnicity for schools. In this case, you can see that in general, not only SAIS schools, but also NAIS schools, we have very little ethnic and race diversity. And the numbers have not changed. The last time we did a survey like this was 6 years ago. So unfortunately, we haven't moved the needle that much. But when it comes to blind spots for the lack of race and ethnic diversity, that might be that it might deter you from enacting, again, policies and plans for the school that might be in accordance with current changes in society, but also, as I mentioned, we are also seeing rapid changes in student demographics and families. When it comes also to diversity being a reflection of your value, many of our schools talk about how important race and ethnicity and inclusion are as part of our mission or statements, right? And yet we lack that representation in the school in the board, at the board level. So again, this is an opportunity to reflect on where we are. What is as a board, what is the look that we want for diversity for our school, and what is the value that it has for the school work and its mission. So Debra or Jack, I don't know if you want to add.
And I'd point out this is just, it's not all SAIS schools responding to this. So this is sort of representative sample within the larger NAIS survey. But I think it was 2 years ago, I actually wrote in the trend book about this. And particularly looking at higher education, they've been looking at greater diversity at the board level to be driving more diversity initiatives to make it more top down. And it's been working a bit in higher education. I would add too, going back to the parent percentages on boards, I worry about this a little bit in our region. NAIS recommends 50% parents and 50% of kind of other representation. That can be really difficult to achieve. Has anybody in here gotten to that level, sort of that roughly 50% mark on the parent? Come on, raise them proud, that's pretty exciting. It can be a difficult thing to do, but this is where grandparents can be really helpful. I have seen this interesting recycling of grandparents who were on the board before. Alumni parents, that kind of thing. It just helps to just diversify your board, because what's the issue with parents? Yeah, they're close, right? That trustee hat, that parent hat, it can be much more complex to manage. So there is that role diversity, but this piece of diversity, and some schools have gotten into, building out, spreadsheets or tables or whatever, just tracking not just these areas of diversity, but what kind of skills are we looking for? What role do these people play in the community, so they can track it a little more readily and they can plan, just more proactively.
Okay, thank you. In terms of board selection and terms, in our survey, we found that the vast majority of SAIS schools, they use a board vote, that is self-perpetuating, is the most common way to elect board members. And that was also in line with what we see at the national trends. It's close to 7 in 10 schools using this approach, and for NAIS schools, it was close to 6 in 10. And on the right-hand side, what you see is the stated terms for both board members and for board chairs. Board members are represented in green, and the board chairs are represented in yellow. So the vast majority of schools mentioned that the stated term for board members was 3 years, and for board chairs, it was 2 followed by 3 years. In the case of NAIS schools, it was very similar for board members. Most of board members have a stated term for 3 years, but in the case of board chairs, it seemed to be lower the number of schools saying that the term was 2 years. It was more evenly split between 2 and 3 years. In terms of term limits, more than 4 in 10 SAIS schools indicated that their board members and chairs have 1 renewable term. On the left-hand side, you see the term limits for board members, and on the right-hand side is for board chairs. And here, let me pause a second to talk about the importance of having term limits, because as one of the things that we noticed is that 8% of SAIS schools said that they were not term limits for board members, and 13% say the same thing about not having term limits for board chairs. So why is it important to have term limits? Because the same way that essentially is to guarantee that the board continues to have the right skills in terms of leadership. Without having term limits, it's difficult for you to bring on new talent, new leaders, and to make sure also that even the changes in the school, that you're also bringing the new type of leadership that is needed. And that will be representing different perspective, again, as we were talking earlier, networks, etc. So board source also recommends to maybe look at the way that you are recruiting and moving, again, away from your traditional networks. But the other important thing about term limits is that it will guarantee that you're focusing on what is the right skills and perspective needed for the future of the school, where you're heading versus where you have been before, in the past.
Yeah, I just want to comment too on that last slide. How many of you have term limits in this room for your board members? How many of you have a mechanism by which you can override whatever that is, and you just sometimes need to do that? It's been interesting talking to some heads of schools, particularly really big schools, really, the joy of a smaller school is you can move fast. The downside is you don't have as much money to move. The big school, you have more money, but it is like turning a tanker ship. And so when I've talked to school heads at the bigger schools in particular, they said, it can be hard to keep momentum going, because when you have turnover with term limits, you feel like you're starting back all over again with an initiative that's going to take you 15 to 20 years to move. So I think finding a balance in there between making sure you've got term limits, making sure you're refreshing your board, but also having a core that really understands what you're doing in the long term, particularly if you're a bigger, older, more complex school. It's just some feedback I've been getting from heads, and I'll be interested to see sort of how that bears out. And then this one, I've gotten a lot of questions. As you know, SAIS will come to your school, we'll do different workshops. And one of the bigger questions I've been getting is about governance and recruitment. How do we get new trustees on our board? How do we bring them? A big one that a lot of schools use are having people serve on task forces or committees before they become board members, sort of a try it before you buy it approach. So that if you really don't like them, you can end the task force and everybody can move on. You call it something else 6 months later. But it is a very common practice out there, and one that I think is a good one. Particularly if you're nimble, if you've got 15 or so board members, that tends to be the sweet spot on board functionality. This is a process by which you can get more work done, but also try out potential future board members. Along that recruiting for the board, these are some of the questions you can ask, and again, we're providing these slides, but just, what's ahead for the school? What skills and insight do you need? We have Judith and Rutledge here from Charleston Day School. Somehow they managed to actually move a building in downtown Charleston. Rutledge, was it 3 feet?
Yes.
Do you know how much it takes to move a building 3 feet in Charleston? There's a lot of conversations that have to be had, and they managed to do it in 18 months. That is recruiting for a particular need. Diversity, does the board represent the various constituencies, communities, and other characteristics? And then that role piece, particularly board leadership. This is something that we've been really looking at carefully, drilling down on pretty hard. What makes a good board member, say for fundraising, doesn't necessarily make a great board chair. And having a really good, succinct plan for succession planning is critical. So if you've got a really good board chair, but you don't see anybody in the pipeline that's really bringing those leadership skills, you really want to focus on what makes a good board chair for our school and what will make a good board chair going forward. You want to recruit specifically for that. It's not who missed the meeting in May when you were electing the board chair, but really what does that line look like? Other goals in the nomination process, experience with potential board members, as I mentioned, way to recruit members who may not think of putting their names forward. Those are the people we like the most, right? Like if somebody's a little too eager to serve on the board, aren't you a little bit suspicious? I am inherently suspicious of those people. But to really plan that out and say, okay, who do we want on the board? Who do we proactively think that we need or want, either in our community, in the school community, or in the wider community? Really think about where the head's voice is in the system. You don't want to stack the deck, but you do want to make sure that these people know the head and the head feels very supported. And then transparency of process. So if somebody asks your board, how do you think about recruitment? How does somebody get on the board? What is your answer? And being really ready for that. I did put together a sample calendar. As many of you know, I'm a Virgo, so I bring a lot of compulsiveness to my work. You shouldn't be thinking about the whole nominations process in, say, March or April. How many of you think about it in March or April primarily? I know you're out there. It's really August, September to start that, saying, okay, whose terms are re-upping? Are they going to want to be staying on the board? Do we want them to stay on the board? Professional development during the year, really identifying those openings and starting to say, who do we want? So that by the time you get into spring, people have actually met these people, whether they know they're being vetted or not. Amada, next slide. So February, March, April, actively communicating with individuals who might be good board members. At that point, they should be familiar names to the board. You should actually know, who the potential people are out there. Late April, you're doing your board evaluation. And then May, you've known now for a while what that final slate might look like. And you have that first line, and you have the second line, who really might be considered next year for board members. And then so May, you're not looking for people with a pulse. You actually know what's happening. Any questions about that? How many of you really proactively lay out a calendar like this on the governance front? Excellent.